Ladies and gentlemen, the Joint Money Committee's meeting will come to order of House Appropriations, House Finance, and Senate Appropriations and Finance. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the 74th Governor of Virginia, the Honorable Glenn Youngkin. Governor Youngkin, let's hear some good news.
Well, good morning. It's 79 degrees out and it's August. That's pretty good news. I'd just like to first thank everybody for coming together this morning. Chairman Knight, Madam President, Chairwoman Howe, thank you very much. It's so good to be with all of you this morning. Almost 7 months ago, we joined together across the street in our historic Capitol building to mark the beginning of a new day in Virginia. I'm excited to be again with you here today to celebrate the progress that we've made together and discuss the path ahead. 7 months ago, House and Senate in partnership on the priorities that matter most to Virginians: the rising cost of living, great schools for our children, safe neighborhoods and communities, and an economy that lifts up all boats. And finally, a government that works for the people. We all should be incredibly proud of the work we've done on behalf of Virginians across the Commonwealth who are sitting at their kitchen tables dealing with these issues every day. The conventional wisdom doubted that we would be able to deliver, and I suspect maybe even a few people in this room doubted as well. But here we are 7 months later, looking back on a historic set of accomplishments and looking forward to the next chapter, or as I like to call it, day 2. As we prepare for the next session, I'd like you to know that I remain firmly committed to working alongside each of you, delivering for Virginians together. Our shared priorities: lowering the cost of living, giving our children the education that they deserve, keeping our communities safe, creating jobs and growing the economy, and transforming government to serve the people. These will not change. This will result in a stronger Commonwealth, making us the best place to live, work, and raise a family. As we look forward, I do think it's worth reflecting on where we've been. For me personally, it starts with the love of my life, our First Lady, Suzanne Youngkin. The same steadfast faith that she holds inspired me as a younger man and still guides us both today. She continues to be a fabulous mother to our 4 children, who are now all scattered on their own life journey. And she does that while taking on the duties of the First Lady in an inspiring way. You know, when I'm at an event where Suzanne is speaking, I'll be standing behind her, I guess much like she's sitting behind me right now, and I'll look at her and I'll think to myself, wow, that's my wife. Friends, that's pretty cool. Suzanne and I have traveled many miles over these last many months, and we've heard from Virginians about the state of our Commonwealth, and one thing repeatedly stands out. Virginians can tell the difference between the way we do things here in the Commonwealth and how things are done in Washington, D.C. The first of those differences, and why we are here today, is our Commonwealth's balance sheet. Our bipartisan budget that the General Assembly passed, and I had the great honor to sign back in June, laid a strong foundation and delivered on so many of the promises of the Day One game plan. Together, we provided $4 billion of tax relief, a record tax cut, at a time when Virginians are feeling the pinch from the silent thief that is inflation. Together, we delivered on our promise to pass the largest education budget in Virginia's history. Together, we also included a record $400 million in new funding for law enforcement, pay raises, money for equipment, school resource officers to keep our kids safe, and a new training facility for the heroic men and women of the Virginia State Police. Demeaning police is no way forward. In Virginia, we support our law enforcement officers. In Virginia, we invest, and our Commonwealth will be safer for it. We also made landmark commitments to site development, a key part of our long-term plan for attracting new jobs and fostering economic development. As we cultivate the economy that will lift up Virginians, we must also facilitate a state government that works for Virginians, standing up for greater accountability, transparency, efficiency, and administering a path forward that rises above partisan politics. Today, I formally report to the General Assembly that Virginia ended the fiscal year with a record general fund balance. Of course, you are all aware of the roughly $2 billion in unplanned revenue surplus for the fiscal year ended June 30th. We all knew about much of that revenue as the General Assembly completed work on the budget back in June. But I'm incredibly proud to share, and hope Virginians will be proud to hear, that our state government spent roughly $1.2 billion less than was appropriated by the General Assembly. And the combination of the roughly $2 billion in unplanned revenue and the $1.2 billion of unspent appropriations resulted in a $3.2 billion cash surplus at year end. Now, before we all get too excited, there are two important things to remember. The first is that the carefully planned budget that Chairman Knight and Chairwoman Howell negotiated anticipated much of these funds. The second is that it is not government's money. It belongs to the taxpayers. On the first topic, over $1.2 billion of this cash surplus will be reappropriated, and another $900 million is set aside for a constitutionally mandated rainy day fund deposit, including a potential super deposit. $585 million is reserved for the uses set out in the budget in expectation of these unplanned revenues. An additional $250 million for deposit in the Virginia retirement system. $150 million to pay for the I-64 widening project without adding to the state's debt. $100 million for inflation-driven capital project cost overruns, and $85 million for economic development projects. And finally, we all provided $131 million to the Water Quality Improvement Fund from unplanned revenues. After accounting for all earmarked uses of this cash surplus, I've directed the comptroller to assign $397 million for deposit into a fund for taxpayer relief. Our balance sheet is in a strong position, and our substantial reserve funds have grown sharply from their pre-pandemic levels. Together, we are lowering tax burdens and making the critical investments needed to strengthen Virginia. The balance in the Water Quality Improvement Fund has tripled since 2019, and that's not including the $131 million deposit required from this year's unplanned revenues. The balance in the Transportation Trust Fund has grown by 2/3, despite our dynamic transportation program, standing at $2.75 billion at the end of fiscal year 2022. Our revenue reserves are set to reach nearly $4.3 billion by the end of this biennium, with reserves exceeding 15%, an amount that I expect no one in this room ever imagined we would reach. While the statute requires every dollar of the surplus to be assigned on the balance sheet, the right thing to do is return unplanned revenue to taxpayers. Again, it's not our money. It belongs to the hardworking taxpayers of Virginia. Last July, in one of the earliest proposals from our campaign, we proposed sending refund checks back to Virginians. And that's exactly what we're going to do. When government collects more money than it anticipates and rightfully spends less than it plans, it only makes sense to give the money back to the people who earned it. So please make no mistake. The budget we will introduce in December and the final budget that I would intend to sign next year will once again include tax reductions, with today's $397 million as a down payment. I'm confident that when we put politics aside and forget about who gets the credit, we will again get this done together. We can do this knowing that our AAA bond rating is secure. When I travel to New York in September to meet with the bond rating agencies, I will reaffirm our shared commitment to protecting Virginia's reserves and the bond rating they underpin. That is another stark difference in how we operate in our Commonwealth and how Washington, D.C. operates. For years, Washington has spent recklessly, adding to the federal debt year after year and running up deficit after deficit. The federal government has borrowed and printed, and now the unfortunate truth is the bill is coming due. The result is skyrocketing inflation, the likes of which many Virginians have never seen in their lifetime. Virginians feel it at the gas pump. They feel it at the grocery store. They feel it in paying their rent or making a mortgage payment. And these inflationary policies are stealing from every Virginian every single day. And they've led to an inevitable economic tightening across the country that could harm our economic progress here in Virginia. I know that Secretary Cummins has shared with these committees our view of what economic growth in Virginia really means. And plainly speaking, we're concerned less with formula-driven accolades and more with real results, particularly when compared to our competitor states. In the 8 years before our partnership began, Virginia was plainly falling behind. We were 47th in the country for job recovery coming out of the pandemic. Our economy had mustered growth of less than 1% in that 8-year period. We were losing jobs to states like Florida and Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Since January through June, we've been top 15 in the country for job recovery, adding jobs faster in states like Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina, with 100,000 more Virginians working today versus in January. We've recruited iconic companies like Boeing and Raytheon to build their futures here. And boy, was I so honored to stand in the Science Museum and welcome Lego to Virginia, which will now be home to Lego's first American manufacturing facility, investing $1 billion in creating nearly 1,700 new jobs. Companies in Virginia are already seeing results too. Advanced Auto Parts recently announced an expansion in New Kent County. Hilton has committed to adding 300 jobs to its Northern Virginia corporate headquarters. And these results are being seen around the Commonwealth, with over 17,000 jobs in Southwest and Southside Virginia. As we chart a path towards normalcy, Virginians are returning to work. To be clear, while I'm pleased with the 100,000 jobs added since January, this month we saw the pace of growth slow down. Given the storm clouds spun up by failed federal policies, it's now more important than ever to double down on the state policies that make Virginia attractive for new businesses. I met with the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates 2 weeks ago, specifically to discuss the challenges facing the Commonwealth's economy. This is an extraordinary collection of business leaders that we can utilize far more than they have been used in the past. The months ahead may be rocky. They may be rocky at a national level, but the consensus from Virginia's top business leaders is that the Commonwealth can navigate these rough seas. To further ensure our own economic security and competitiveness, we need to get to work on a few things. We absolutely must lower the cost of doing business in Virginia. For counsel on how to do that, we have to look no further than North Carolina, a state that is systematically reducing its business taxes to attract more jobs and investment. We must also continue to reduce red tape. I established under Executive Order 19 the new Office of Regulatory Management to focus on our 25% regulatory reduction plan. Andrew Wheeler is leading that office, and I know the knowledge and experience he brings to the table will be invaluable. And we must continue to make talent and workforce development pillars of our economic approach. Matching skills and workers to the industries of tomorrow has only become more important. It's why I'm so invested in making sure our community college system thrives. And I look forward to continuing to work with the new Community College Board to find a chancellor who can lead the transformation and growth that that system requires. It's also why I want to make sure our veterans are coming home with great paying jobs and tremendous opportunities and a tax structure that encourages them to stay here and not go someplace else. Speaking of good paying jobs, college graduates should not have to use all of their paychecks on student loans. And that's why I'm particularly pleased that almost all of our public universities have kept their tuition flat for this academic year. There are 2 more institutions that Virginia students are still waiting to hear from. But before the good paying job and before the degree comes the classroom. Together we have fueled a historic investment for public education in the Commonwealth. More than $3.1 billion in new investment, a 10% pay raise for our teachers, $100 million in lab school funding to give students meaningful choice within the public school system, $1.25 billion to leverage over $3 billion for school construction and renovations. But money is only part of this equation. We must also keep our kids in the classroom. The learning loss apparent in yesterday's SOL's results teaches us that closing schools and keeping kids out of the classroom did more damage than Virginia's parents could have possibly imagined. In math, we are still 16 points behind pre-pandemic levels. Shamefully, these gaps were much wider among Black students, Hispanic students, English language learners, and students with disabilities. There is an incredible amount of work for us to do to close this gap. For too long now, our students have been failed by a system that emphasized mediocrity instead of excellence, a system that let students fall behind instead of encouraging them to excel. Political appointees of past administrations systematically lowered accreditation standards and passing standards for schools and students. And that made it easier for students to pass standardized tests rather than teaching them to meet a high bar. In January, I said the shell games of accountability were coming to an end. I asked the General Assembly to lock arms with me to raise standards in education. And while I appreciate the legislation that you passed to restore merit-based admissions at our governor's school, the truth is there's still a lot more work to do. A lax approach towards excellence in the classroom is no way to have increasing results. And in the coming weeks, the Virginia Board of Education will begin a process to raise the Commonwealth's accreditation and accountability standards from some of the lowest in the country to the highest. Every child in the Commonwealth deserves the best opportunity we can provide. Let's just recognize that we need to raise the ceiling and the floor. And we've started that path with the Virginia Literacy Act, setting high standards and recognizing that underserved areas need more help. I was very pleased that you approved my amendment to put in additional money for reading coaches in these underserved communities. I'll never accept the argument that says our kids cannot meet these higher standards. I believe that's the soft bigotry of low expectations. They can and they will, and it's up to us to set a high bar worthy of our children's potential. Everything we do in education, of course, remains tied to the core tenet that parents matter. When it comes to what books your child reads or whether your child wears a mask to school, in Virginia, that choice belongs to parents. And I believe this can be a bipartisan basis for a much broader effort to ensure transparency in education and in the lives of their children. We can trust our teachers. We can trust our teachers and local school leaders to act as partners with parents where parents have full access and visibility. It's not controversial, and it shouldn't be partisan. With teachers leading the way at school and parents fully empowered at home, the high standards set for all, we will make sure that Virginia's kids have the launching pad they deserve. Now, speaking of home, in the months ahead, as we begin to craft amendments to the current biennial budget, there are three pressing truths we must confront. The first is that we must do more to address the rash of violent crime that continues to plague many of our cities. Too many Virginians are waking up every morning to the television reports and social media alerts of overnight violence. We've seen an increase in the number of reported homicides, human trafficking, and assaults. That's why I formed the Violent Crime Task Force. These efforts are already showing in Petersburg, in Portsmouth, and in Roanoke that collaboration between local law enforcement, state law enforcement, and national capabilities can make a difference. We also must address the pervasive mental health crisis plaguing our Commonwealth. It is exacerbated by the opioid and fentanyl epidemic that's destroying families and eroding communities. Together, we can make our communities safe again. The second pressing truth we must confront is the realization that the cost to rent or buy a home is too expensive. Skyrocketing real estate taxes driven by inflation, a shortage in supply caused by overburdensome local governments, rising rents, and wait lists for apartments have become too normal in the Commonwealth. If we are serious about the rising cost of living in the Commonwealth, and I know we all are, then we are going to have to get serious about the cost of the places in which we live. The solution to this problem is not more subsidies or loan programs. Instead, we must tackle root causes behind the supply and demand mismatch in places to live. Unnecessary regulations, overburdensome and inefficient local governments, restrictive zoning policies, and an ideology of fighting tooth and nail against any new development. The third pressing truth we must confront is that previous administrations left Virginia woefully behind schedule when it comes to meeting our Chesapeake Bay 2025 goals. The Chesapeake Bay is a vital part of the Commonwealth's economic engine, a huge destination for tens of thousands of tourists who visit Virginia each year. And let me tell you, as a Virginia Beach boy, I am committed to being a great steward for this invaluable asset. Part of that is the large commitment to agricultural best management practices in the budget that was passed this past June. Again, I see this as an opportunity to do things differently here than they do in Washington. We do not have to fall neatly into partisan camps and retrench into our typical talking points. Just like with keeping our communities safe, just like with education standards, just like with meaningful economic growth, just like with the Commonwealth's budget, we can get this done together. Togetherness is at the heart of the Virginia spirit, and that spirit goes well beyond the gates of Capitol Square. You know, I stood at the hills of Southwest Virginia a couple weeks ago, looking at the damage that floodwaters had ravaged over one of our communities. What I saw was toughness, determination, and resolve. When I attended the memorial service for two fallen law enforcement heroes in Bridgewater, what I saw was gratitude for service and a deep love for our Commonwealth. When Suzanne and I stood together at Jill's house, which is an overnight care and housing facility for children with special needs in Fairfax County, I saw hope. I saw dignity. We are bonded together by a spirit of liberty, a spirit of Virginia. And together we have delivered during these first 7 months. We've delivered for the Commonwealth. We've delivered for the people. Together we are making lives better. Making lives better for the farmers in Shenandoah Valley, who I just visited this week. The workers on the docks and in the shipyards in Hampton Roads, from the mountains of Southwest Virginia to the banks of the James River, and all who were part of the hustle and bustle of Northern Virginia. Virginians are a talented people who are charting a path to a more prosperous future. They're charting that path with a faith in God, with a devotion to family, and a belief in the limitless possibilities of freedom. My friends, my fellow Virginians, we have enacted historic change, and we're just getting started. As I like to say, just wait for day 2. We collectively won't rest until this is the best state to live, work, and raise a family. And I know you all join me in that aspiration. Thank you very much for your time this morning. God bless you, and God bless the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you again.
Thank you, Governor. Mr. Secretary, we'll wait a minute or so. And okay. Thank you. Now we're going to get a review of the fiscal condition of the state of Virginia from the Honorable Stephen Cummins, our Secretary of Finance.
Madam President, Chairman Knight, Chairwoman Howe, members and staff of the committee, I very much appreciate having the chance to stand before you today and walk you through the 2022 year-end review, talk a bit about the economy, more details on the disposition of unplanned revenues and unspent appropriations, and then just review the fall forecasting process, which I think most of you are very familiar with. So, I think we all know that FY 2022 was a remarkable year. Impact of Fed stimulus going through to individuals and corporates, opening up of the economy as we went throughout the year, and then as we transitioned through the waves of COVID with far less severity along the way. So things really opened back up. On the other side of that, we saw an unprecedented spike in our supply-demand imbalance. We have rising sales, corporate profits, the battle for labor, which has driven wage growth, and obviously a stock market up until the last couple of months was climbing every week. Contrasted it towards the end of the year with China lockdown, Ukraine war, leading to supply chain issues, and at the end of the day, inflation in energy costs, cost of labor, and basic household goods. And that's where we are now standing looking forward into 2023. So if I could, just on a lot of numbers on this chart, I'm going to try to focus you on a few that I think are important. This chart starts with 2019 because of obviously the last year prior to pandemic, just to get a sense of baseline, and then 21 and 22. I want to focus on that fourth column, which is just looking at where we stand today relative to 2019. A startling 36% growth rate, $7.6 billion increase in those 3 years. The 2/3 of that growth came out of our personal income, withholding and non-withholding, with incredible growth rates in non-withholding. And then both our corporate and sales taxes generating about 15% of the increase from 2019 with dramatic growth in our corporate taxes. We'll go into the details on all of these, obviously, in the presentation. 21 to 22, $4.1 billion increase in just this past year of revenues. So some startling numbers. I think we all know that, and that's why we're here with the possibility of doing some exciting things with those excess revenues. Just since the caboose bill that you all passed a couple of months ago, where you were able to allocate an additional $1.25 billion when we did the revenue reforecast in February, this shows you what the $1.9 billion that we actually beat that by as of year end, where that came from. Not surprisingly, because we are consistently conservative on our estimates of non-withholding. Non-withholding and the reduction of refunds accounted for 90% of this increase. Our corporate taxes, sales, and withholding were generally on track, and that really is the story, and we'll continue to beat on that throughout this presentation. So $7.8 billion versus 2019, $6.2 billion beyond the Northam budget, $1.9 billion greater than the caboose bill that you all passed, 16.3% year-over-year growth. I think we all know this is a pretty startling set of numbers that I would argue we will probably never see again in government, the way that we've experienced, and I think, to the governor's comments, managed it extremely well in the budget that was just passed. Going into specific details, more traditional charts of the month by month, 16.3% growth in revenues, and this is pretty steady throughout the course of the year. February, if some of you may remember, we had a timing anomaly within withholding that dropped that down, but it still was a slower month, but very consistent growth year over year throughout the year. Wage growth, changes in jobs in the mix, strong stock market performance, sales, tax revenue as the economy continued to open up with a very liquid consumer, and corporate profitability that continued to accelerate throughout all of this. Focusing on withholding, you can see here competitive wage market that we are all well aware of. This is the #1 topic for everybody we talk to around economic development. 9.5% year-over-year growth, very consistent with the estimate of 9%. Employment over that year, average employment on a month-by-month basis grew about 2%, but as the governor referred to, and you'll see in the charts, most of that really came in the last 6 months. To get us to this 2% year over year. And we believe that, we'll talk about this, we've got great wage growth, which is a great stable baseline. Now if we can add some better job growth, we really have the beginnings of a solid foundation upon which we will be able to look forward and have some optimism that we can continue to sustain things. This shows you now within Virginia, job growth data, earnings growth versus job growth. And I don't want to get into the details of this, but I think the visual is the blue line is change in earnings from 2019 to 2022. The red or pink line is your change in jobs from that same time period. The top is total non-farm statistics. You can see we're just getting back flat in Virginia in this chart, getting close to it. But the earnings change is about 12%, and you can look at different sectors, but very robust growth in earnings, and pretty modest growth overall or actually not overall, no growth with respect to the change in jobs. Okay, non-withholding, this is the real important number that I know we're all watching closely with every month that passes. Most unpredictable source of income. I know in the past there has been times when there was a surprise on this, and this is something that we don't want to get surprised on. So we're going to be spending a lot of time with our JABE team to work on refining our models. This chart actually shows you, I'm not sure many of you have seen this before, what the real composition is of non-withholding, because we always talk about it as capital gains, and it is largely that. Net capital gains is 27%. I would add to that the taxable IRA distributions, which is going to have a market connection as well. So I look at that as about 40% of this category comes from stock market-driven increases. The remainder, next largest, would be partnerships and S-corps. Unfortunately, by the way, this is 2019. The reason it's so far back is it's the most recent data available at a federal level. We don't have this for Virginia, something that we're hoping to start to try to develop. But it is dated, so just take this as a representative. We could all debate what the rates of growth of these might be in the recent times. Partnerships and S-corps at 25%, interest and dividends 24%, and then self-employment income 12%. I would expect a lot of that is gig economy, those who do go ahead and file taxes to make their tax payments. So looking at what's happened to this, and we've looked, you'll see later, we've looked at this back to 1990. We'll go back even farther into the 70s on this, given the current economic circumstances. But you can see relatively flat up until it started to take off in 18-19 when the market really started to lift off. $1.4 billion increase in 21, $1.6 billion increase in fiscal 22. This chart is, again, a lot of numbers. Let's focus at the bottom. That left-hand set of numbers is the number of payments exceeding $100,000. This is estimated payments over the course of the year and final payments at the end of the year. You can see dramatic growth in those that clear that $100,000 bar. And then if you go to the right, this is the actual receipts, millions of payments for those higher payers. You can see that grew rapidly. The far right shows then the percent of the total non-withholding payments. And it's kind of interesting is whereas the two left-hand statistics show the growth, this shows you that all boats rose in this, and that it doesn't really apply to the 80-20 rule when you look at it this way, but it is something that is becoming more important. And I think we all know that the people who benefit from this is a relatively small percentage of our taxpayers in the overall scheme of things. This chart, the green line is NASDAQ, the blue line is S&P 500, the red line is non-withholding, total non-withholding collections. It does appear on this chart that it is pretty well correlated, but I don't know about you, it's not well enough correlated that I would take that to the bank. And it really draws the need, heightens the need for us to really dig in and understand different scenarios of what if we do get a gradual decline in the market? What if we get the sudden shock? I think everybody's been waiting to see the sudden shock rate lately, but the market continues to defy that expectation. Sales and use tax collections. This, as you all recall, AST, accelerated sales tax, was paid in the last month of the year historically. You all changed that, so it would be paid like the monthly payments are in the first month of the following period to move it into FY 2023. Some of the companies paid it either by mistake or because they weren't sure what was happening, so we got some payments in FY 2022. When you cut through all of that, if you adjust for that, which is the right way to look at that, the actual collections in the month of June were 7.6% year over year positive, and our year over year total for sales was 13.3% versus the as reported 9.4% figure. Very solid. I mean, the consumer continues to be healthy. They're buying fewer things, but inflation is making the actual receipts stay in a positive trend. All of us ask the question, as I'm sure you do, is how long can that continue? But frankly, I think that they've defied expectations to date. Whoops. Sorry, I'm missing a slide. Okay, we're missing, let me make sure I didn't, either you, corporate tax, sorry. Corporate tax collections, that's the next in my slide book, is you can see here again, that this is a 30.5% growth year over year in FY 2022, and a dramatic growth in the last 2 years. I think we all know that corporate taxes have been growing dramatically. Large payers really drive this. I think we all know that in particular, the large payers are the ones who have been able to pass through a lot of the cost increases to date. That may be, you're hearing now indications that that is maybe becoming more of a problem, but the corporate world is healthy, and we do believe that that still does have some life to it. Individual refunds, sorry, I did go backwards, my fault. Individual refunds, back on page 15, apologize for that, have been less than expected. And basically what you need to know is that we had anticipated a 5% year-over-year increase in refunds, but they declined by 10%. 5% of fewer refunds, and the average check declined by 21.4%. I think that people paid their estimated payments. Stock market continued to be strong, so there weren't as many refunds that were requested. Quick stop on July, which is now available. You've heard about. If you look at the bottom, which is the right number, when you again adjust for AST, accelerated sales tax, that the overall revenues for the month were up 5.2% versus the 14.1 as reported, and adjusted sales were up 1.8 as opposed to the 62.4% increase. Withholding continued to be quite strong at that 9.5% level. The other ones are down dramatically. That's not, I don't like to see that, but this is a very small month for those types of payments, non-withholding, refunds, and corporate. So we'll watch that, but I would not say that's an alarm bell ringing at this point in time. So bottom line on this is the core revenue sources, income tax, sales tax grew at a combined 9.5%, very steady, seem to be continuing to be steady. Non-withholding grew dramatically, 30.5. We all know we've got to watch that very, very closely. And in July, continued to be okay. So we're going into this year, I'd say still with cautious optimism. Here, looking at some of the economic statistics, this is looking at FY22 forecast from a year ago, and then the actual. Let me focus on that first. So the areas of variation were that GDP was 15+% lower than expected, 4.5% down to 3.8. Personal income growth grew about 4 times what was expected, 1% to 3.6. And CPI, as we all know, was about 50% higher. We expected 4.6, and it was 7.1%. Going to the 2023 expectation in the standard forecast from IHS Markit, we see the economy continuing to slow, GDP down to 0.7% from 3.8. Pressure on wages as they rise, unemployment continuing to go down with the stress on looking for workers across all corporates. Inflation down pretty dramatically, but it's still too high at 5.7%. The Fed's not going to be satisfied with that. They're going to continue to try to put the brakes on. Looking at employment, you all have seen this chart each time we've been here. The governor updated this. It's now 100,000 jobs, but we're still down 110,000 jobs since the pandemic dip, where we lost 27,000 jobs. So this shows the broad-based impact. Again, a lot of numbers, different. It is some different sources and timing on this, but I think the main message is that you can see the areas where we lost, not surprising. You can see leisure and hospitality was down almost 50%. lost 210,000 jobs. We rebounded to 192 by this study. And you can see in our case that only 4 of our subgroups, education and health, IT, professional and business services, and transportation and distribution have rebounded, utilities have rebounded past where we were pre-pandemic. Everything else is flat to down. Again, another chart that you've seen before shows that on the good side that the southern tier has all rebounded and is above where they were pre-pandemic. Next would be the periphery of the Northern Virginia, the Northern Shenandoah Valley, and over to Greater Fredericksburg. But Northern Virginia is kind of through the Northern Virginia, Richmond, down to Hampton Roads are down 3+%, and still Roanoke, Lynchburg, and New River Valley are down 4+%. We don't have, continue to not have the full explanation of this. This is something that economists need and will continue to dig into, but it obviously has to be a mix of activities, retirements, second wage earners not yet back, and then, as we all know, child care challenges are keeping still a lot of people on the sideline. All those things are not unique to Virginia, and this is perhaps one that is most troubling, is where we stand versus the U.S. in the recovery, where we're still almost 3% below pre-pandemic. U.S. is back, and our competitor states are up 103 to 105% versus pre-pandemic levels. This is obviously really important for the benefit of our citizens, but it also is going to be an increasingly important driver of revenue growth for the government, that we need to see more job growth, and it's why that is a focus that all of us in administration share. Let's move on to unplanned revenues and unspent appropriations of $3.2 billion that the governor referred to. You all know this well in advance. You did took some actions with some of the money that we saw coming on the revenue side as we approached year end. And also then we knew, we started breaking down our own financials at a much more granular level on a monthly basis last year. And with that transparency, we saw that appropriations were well exceeding our expenditures, and through good management by our administration, the agency heads came in $1.2 billion below appropriations to get to the $3.2 billion. $1 billion went to tax rebates for the excesses of taxing in 21, $905 for the deposit to revenue stabilization fund, rainy day fund, and then the nearly $600 million for the VRS contribution, I-64 widening, capital overruns, which are significant. This is another pay down on that, and then some economic development incentives that you were able to provide for. The details of the $3.2 billion here, you can see the uses of this combined surplus, balance of the rainy day fund in addition to the $500 that was in the caboose bill, another $400 million that is triggered, the contingent unplanned spending for contingent unplanned revenues, that's the $585, the rainy day super deposit that is potentially triggered of roughly $500 million, the reappropriations that are required of our unspent appropriations of $600 million out of that, of $800 million out of the 1.2, and then reappropriations that are available at the discretion of the governor, could be reappropriated or not, and then the WQIF deposit of 131, and then the voluntary taxpayer relief deposit that the governor referred to in his remarks. So I was told I shouldn't include this chart by a number of people but I wanted to do it just so you all understand the web we have to weave to figure out these payments, because it is quite a complicated structure. We've looked at all other AAAs, and I can assure you ours is a little more complicated, but it works, and I think it's clear that this was well thought out by a smart group of people a long time ago, and it's doing the trick for us right now. So I'm going to try to do this very quickly. Unplanned revenues, first you evaluate the average year-over-year growth for the past 6 years, and you compare that to the latest year growth, 16.3%. The average year-over-year growth over the last 6 years is about 6%. So we have 10% roughly of a premium. You take half of that and apply it to your revenues. That calculates that first deposit. 50% of the growth excess. Then you trigger a super deposit if your growth is greater than 8%, which ours is at 16.3, and if your year-over-year growth is 1/2 times the average year-over growth over the prior 6 years, which it is. And the third trigger is if your projected growth for the next fiscal year is greater than 5% increase, you trigger the super deposit. We've triggered the first two. We'll see on the third when we get to the revenue reforecast that Jabe and Gaker put together. We have to provide for it because there is a real possibility that we do that. That's back to that $500 million. Then you go into WQIF. If 10%, if there's an excess, 50% of that goes into revenue reserve. The remainder of the unplanned revenue is then added to your unexpended appropriations, and then you go through a waterfall to WQIF, transportation, and then other non-recurring expenditures. Okay. The really great news is out of all that, and I've talked to people who were part of this way back when to understand how did you come up with this, and they confirmed that they never expected we'd get to 15%. But you can just see the remarkable outcome of what's happened here over the last couple of years, and I'll just echo what the governor said is, what an awesome balance sheet to be standing in front of right now, and especially with some of the uncertainty. We did a call with the rating agencies when you completed the budget. They were waiting anxiously, and they commented on where we were with our surplus at just over 6% already and how pleased they were with that. So this is a great place to be in, and I think it's appropriate, and I think that we'll continue to hang our hats on that as giving us confidence that we can continue to maintain AAA status for a long time ahead. So all that being said, I think we all know that it's not great for everybody. And these few charts, I think, give us a good indication that we have hourly earnings up 5.2% latest period, year over year. All CPI is up 8.5%. That's what the Fed is watching. But as you go down to middle and lower income citizens, the things that matter, and as I was listening to the governor, we should have had housing in this. What you pay at the gas pump, what you're paying for things like eggs, milk, meat, and then housing, it's tough. He calls it the silent thief of inflation, and it's roaring right now when you look at these numbers and what they're doing to the people who have much higher proportion of their own household budget allocated to things like this. And we need to keep that in mind, and it is largely behind the thoughts about what we do with the excess revenues and unspent appropriations is let's give it back to the people. They need it, and it is more appropriate than ever that we focus on that. So balance sheet is in incredible position. We believe tax relief is the best use of surplus funds. We wish we could do more, frankly, but this is prescribed. Much of this is prescribed with what we need to do, and we think that we're in a good place with the key transportation fund is up 66% over 2019, and as the governor said, WQIF is up 3 times when you add the 131 that's going to go in through our waterfall. So very good position. I will add, we didn't have this on here, that as a result of the contributions to VRS last year and what's built in for this year, it's another $1 billion that's going to go against the pension liability that is really important, and we're in a good place. So we'll come back with more of that as we look at, so you've all asked the finance team to look at where we stand with the reserves, and we'll come back with more on that as well as the pension fund to give you a sense of how we stack up versus our peer group. This chart you haven't seen before. It's something that early on my arrival worked with DPB on, is under all of the whipped cream in the last couple of budgets, what's really going on the core run rate recurring budget. It's hard to figure that out, so the DPB team did a great job of looking at, and we waited for 22 final, and then looked at 23. And we'll share this with the committee staff, obviously, is what's happening to the stuff that really is, as you're in a time of challenge, you go through the fat, the muscle, and then into the bone. This is bone. This is recurring what you need to continue to deliver what you've committed. And if you look at this, it's 1% growth in 2021, jumps to 9% 2022, in 2023, another 9%. I know when you've been doing the budgeting, you've been trying to protect that run rate, but it's still too high. I don't think anybody here believes that 9% is a sustainable business model for us, and we need to work on how we can get that under control, that this will quickly become a problem that will choke us. So I think I know you keep that in mind, we do as well, and that will be our focus going into budgeting time. I want to also remind everybody that when we reforecast in February that we didn't touch the budget for 23-24. And as a result of where we ended up 2022 actual revenues and where we stand versus 2023 budget, we've got a cushion of $4.1 billion at the beginning of this. So we feel like we're in a good place. We've got to be very careful about what we're doing with this money, and that we don't put a rope out there that we can hang ourselves on. We know we won't do that. We don't want to do that. But there is room to do the things that we're talking about within the appropriations and some of the things that the governor is planning to introduce as well. So I think I've touched on all of this. $3.2 billion of unplanned revenues, unspent appropriations. Out of that, looking for $400 million in taxpayer relief. Couldn't have a stronger balance sheet, and we believe that we can, by doing so, we will give a meaningful assist to those people who need this most. So I'll wrap up here, take questions. Fall forecasting, I think you're all familiar with that. Actually, the meeting with Gaker in August was the brainchild of the governor of, we got an unbelievable team of people. Let's use them more actively. They actually responded incredibly well to doing that. We got a lot out of that first meeting in terms of just guidance. We weren't trying to put together estimates, but just kind of a tone of the room. We'll be getting JABE together, the Joint Advisory Board of Economists, in October to start that process. In November, we start back with Gaker once we have the work out of JABE. And then in December, we're looking to come back by December 15th on our revenue reforecast, and the governor will present his budget within the week after that. So thank you all, and I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Cummins, for that. Do we have any questions from up here? Looking good so far.
Thank you.
Senator Norman?
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. We've had this discussion about semantics before, but I know it was a misnomer on slide 26 where you repeatedly used the word surplus. We don't have a surplus. We have unanticipated revenues in government.
We thought we caught all those. I'm sorry.
But I'm a little curious with the gentleman with your extensive financial background is, I know the Fed is working very hard to try to constrain and suppress inflation, but I just look at things in my little small world, and the businesses that I am in, as we ended the fiscal year and started preparing the budgets for the next year, included a 25% increase in wages and tax and benefits issues. And I'm just curious, based on your experience, where we have this pressure on wages, and I'll use the term, and it has resulted in an empowerment of some workforces. How does that manage against the inflationary pressures where you, in one of your slides, you got eggs going up 36%? How does the Fed control that?
You know, it's hard. Once the momentum starts shifting, it's hard to put the brakes on that big truck. But I think they are doing their best, and I think as they'll watch what happens here and start to lighten up on the brakes. But I think it's all about what starts with the consumer. That's what's been driving our economy, and that's what drives corporates. It's what drives the demand, drives wages, and ultimately, and this is the perplexing part for the Fed, is that we still have 200,000+ open jobs across our country, and wages continue to rise. Ultimately, that's got to come through in increased prices and lower spendable dollars for the consumer, which is going to be the engine. It's been the engine that's driven us for the last 5+ years, in particular, has accelerated. So I think it's very difficult. I think people are all speculating on the 30+% chance of recession, 40% chance of we'll get through this, it'll be a little bit bumpy. And I think very, very low percent that we're going to just do a touch and go on this. I'm concerned about it. The supply chain continues to be a problem, so I don't see a lot of relief on that for some time until demand really does soften.
Thank you. We have a question from Delegate Watson, and we've got Senator Marsden will be next.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, with my fiscal hat on as on House Finance, I want to thank you and the Department of Taxation for the additional detail on withholding. This has been something that has been very important for us to have a better understanding, and these charts do help on that road. But I want to follow up with Senator Norman's comment about unanticipated revenue, and also in your response when you're talking about low employment or not filling jobs, and particularly on slide 22, on slide 21 and on slide 9, we have issues of government not recovering. And that means law enforcement, it means teachers, it means direct care providers. It certainly also means mental health issues. So I just wanted to underscore that because I'm sincere in my compliments, Mr. Secretary, that you had me until you said whipped cream. And this is an important aspect of what we look at in the budget as to whether or not our efforts to try to meet some of the salary gaps are not essential, that we now deal with the inflation about whether or not those efforts are really meaningful in filling these important employment gaps that your slides show on 21 and 9.
Great. Okay. I appreciate that, and I agree with that. And I apologize for the use of whipped cream. I was referring to the unanticipated revenues being so extraordinary that we were able to do so many things that never could have been anticipated, and then we focus on what really goes in permanent. I completely agree with you, and I know the governor does, on the things you mentioned of the wage increases across many different government entities, and I believe on that because that pops out, and it's local government, it's all the things you talked about, and the wages are low across every one of those entities, and it's very hard to get people to come back into those jobs. So I think that's a big deal.
Thank you, Mr.
I agree with you.
Secretary.
Thank you.
Senator Marsden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Consumer debt. My understanding is, we had been making, progress with the reduction in consumer debt in this country, and now I'm getting reports nationally that consumer debt is up, credit cards, things like that. Do we have any Virginia-specific information on that, and what is the anticipated impact of increasing consumer debt going to have on our economy in view of what you're aware of?
Yeah, very, very interesting question, because we've been trying to get that as well, and we've just made contact with the card people at MasterCard who have a database they will make available to us. They do it with other states. We just learned this. That does give more detail on what's going on with the consumer, and you can see it at the state level. We need to get some banks to help us too, because that is more by vendor. We need to get to the individual to understand that. That being said, yes, it's grown, and we worry that the spending habits have changed for people over the last 2 or 3 years because they've been so liquid. And so you've got to start looking at the credit stats and defaults, and they're not seeing any indication. But as we all know, as you see job losses, as you see wages cut, that's going to be one of the indicators. And we are working to get insight so we can have earlier warning signals on those things, but that's not there right now. Yeah.
Delegate Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. I echo Delegate Watts' comments about the wonderful report. I especially appreciated both your and the governor's emphasis on housing. It's the biggest slice of anybody's paycheck, and so it has to start any serious conversation about the cost of living. And I also shared so many of the governor's priorities on the supply side reforms on permitting and zoning. That absolutely has to be core to the solution. And also, we know that there are some units that the private sector will never turn a profit building. the units that serve permanently disabled Virginians, low-income retirees, the kinds that we've been neglecting in Virginia now for decades, which I think is why it was so troubling to many of us to see that the last budget cut $200 million for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And so I would encourage us, as we think about all those things that are bone and not whipped cream, that this budget continue to include serious investments in the subsidies that build the units that must be subsidized, because there really isn't a market-based solution to those kinds of units. And so I would urge that we not see supply-side reforms and subsidies as competing solutions, but rather a balance to strike and a dial to tune. And I wonder where in this budget you see opportunities to serve those Virginians.
Yeah, been a big conversation. I expect you'll hear a lot more about that from the governor. That is a top priority. It's affects our citizens. It also has a direct impact on our workforce availability. So very aligned. Thanks.
Any other questions of the Secretary? Okay, Mr. Secretary, thank you
Thank
for
you.
that comprehensive
Thank you all.
report.
Yep.
And I don't think I see any more business here other than maybe wishing Delegate Ware a happy birthday tomorrow. So, meeting adjourned.